The cockpit door will not open. Because both hands on the yoke belong to a woman, who was never supposed to be flying this plane. Cedar Ridge approach. Both pilots down. I am a certified flight instructor. I am in the cockpit. Copy that. Say your name. Briar Kincaid. Kincaid. As in Emmett Kincaid? Her hands do not shake. Her voice does not break. We'll talk about that later. Right now. Help me land this plane. 31,000 feet above the plains, a storm is building, where no storm should be. A man 4 rows back sits, with his eyes closed, and his hands folded like someone at prayer. Except he isn't praying. He's waiting. And 600 miles away, a 74-year-old woman just set down her tea, because the little airplane on her screen has stopped moving. This is Flight 1147. And it has only just begun.
The cockpit door will not open. Because both hands on the yoke belong to a woman who was never supposed to be flying this plane. Because the man beside her stopped breathing correctly 6 minutes ago. And because somewhere behind her, 138 strangers believe someone else is in control. They are wrong. Cedar Ridge approach. This is Continental Crest 1147. Both pilots down. I am a rated flight instructor. I am in the cockpit. Copy that. Say your name. Briar Kincaid. Kincaid, as in Emmett Kincaid. Her hands do not move. Her voice does not shake. We'll talk about that later. Right now. Help me land this plane standing by. Talk to me, Kincaid. 31,000 feet above the Kansas plains. A storm is building where no storm should be this early in the season. A man 4 rows back sits with his closed and his hands folded like someone at prayer. Except he isn't praying, he's waiting. And 600 miles east, in a kitchen with a blue door 2 towns over, a 74-year-old woman has just set down her tea because the little airplane on her tablet screen has stopped moving. This is Flight 1147, and it has only just begun. Picture a Tuesday morning in October, Cedar Ridge Regional Airport, Gate 14. Not a large airport. Not a small one either, the kind that exists in 100 versions, across a dozen states, and belongs, in the end, to none of them in particular. Fluorescent light that hums, at a pitch, nobody hears anymore because everybody has already stopped listening for it. A vending machine near the restrooms with a torn wrapper, stuck behind the glass. Permanently, the way certain small failures become permanent fixtures in places built for constant motion. A departure board flipping its letters over, with a sound like a deck of cards, shuffled by somebody who's done it 10,000 times and never once needed to look down at their hands. Nobody in that terminal is paying attention to the woman sitting near Gate 14C. That was always the case with Briar Kincaid. She didn't fill a room the moment she entered it. She didn't need to. She was the kind of person you sat beside for an hour on a delayed connection, and only realized afterward, much later, driving home, replaying the conversation without meaning to that. She'd said maybe 4 things the entire time, and every one of them had mattered more than anything the louder people around her had said. She's 28 years old. Blonde hair pulled back into a low, practical braid, not the kind that says, "Look at me." The kind that says, "I don't have time for you to look at me." A gray flight jacket, unzipped, sleeves pushed to the elbow, worn soft the way good gear gets worn soft after enough years of actual use instead of display. Underneath it, a plain black shirt. No logo, no slogan, nothing printed anywhere on her at all, because Briar Kincaid dressed the way she flew. Clean, deliberate, nothing wasted, nothing decorative, nothing that didn't earn its place. At her feet, a duffel bag that had crossed more state lines than most people's cars. In her lap, a manila folder open to a checklist titled Type Rating Observation. Boeing 737-800, and at the bottom of the page, a stamped authorization bearing Continental Crest's logo and a case number that had cost her 3 separate emails and 1 increasingly patient phone call with a scheduling office in another time zone to finally secure. Because Briar Kincaid wasn't just flying home, she was going to observe. 6 hours in the jump seat of a real commercial aircraft, certified and logged. to close out the paperwork that would let her finally train commercial pilots on the actual airframe. Her students spent hundreds of hours, flying only in simulation, back in Millbrook, Ohio, in a converted hangar that smelled permanently of hydraulic fluid and the specific burnt-bottom coffee that gets left on a warmer 3 hours too long, and nobody throws out, because nobody wants to be the one who admits they've stopped tasting it. She'd earned that seat the way she earned everything in her life. Not by being the loudest person in any room she walked into. By being the only one still working long after the room had emptied out around her. 4 years in the Air Force, just over 2,000 flight hours logged. Before her 25th birthday, most of them in trainers that nobody outside the service had ever heard of. Learning to read a cockpit the way some people learn to read a familiar room in the dark. Not by looking harder, but by trusting the shape of things they'd already memorized, without meaning to. She hadn't left the service because she'd stopped loving it. She'd left because her grandmother was turning 70. A Sloan. In a house with a blue door, and there wasn't a version of Briar's future that didn't include being close enough to answer a phone at 3 in the morning if it ever needed answering. Her instructor at flight school, a weathered man, everyone simply called Harlan, 61 years old, 40 of them spent in cockpits of one kind or another, had written in her final evaluation. Something she still kept folded in the same manila folder that now sat in her lap, because some sentences are worth carrying around, long after the moment that produced them has passed. Kincaid does not memorize procedures the way most students memorize them. She absorbs them in the way a native speaker absorbs grammar, without translating it first. She stopped thinking in steps somewhere around her 3rd month here. Now she simply flies, and the rest of us try to keep pace. That evaluation sat folded in a drawer back in Ohio most of the year. It didn't matter here at Gate 14C on an ordinary Tuesday. What mattered here was the letter in her lap, and the boarding call that had just come over the terminal speakers, flattened and slightly distorted, the way all airport announcements are flattened and distorted, as though the building itself has grown tired of making them sound important. Continental Crest Flight 1147, Cedar Ridge to Brookhaven, non-stop. She stood, picked up her bag, joined the line. There is something you should know about why Briar Kincaid needed this particular flight on this particular Tuesday. More than she had let herself fully admit, even standing in that boarding line with her folder tucked under one arm, because Brookhaven was where her grandmother lived. A corner house, a blue door, a garden that got away from itself every October, and nobody minded. Least of all Lorraine Kincaid, who had decided decades ago that she preferred things that grew wild over things that behaved themselves on schedule. And, because in 6 days there was a hearing, a Federal Aviation Records hearing, filed under a case number, Briar had spent 11 months quietly building on her own, in the evenings, after her last student had gone home and the hangar had gone dark, except for the single desk lamp she kept burning, over a stack of documents she'd told almost no one about. A hearing requesting formal review of an accident report, filed 20 years ago. An accident that had taken her grandfather, a report the government had closed out under 2 words so clean, so bloodless, so carefully final, that it had taken Briar until she was old enough to read a technical document herself, to understand exactly how much those 2 words had cost her family, and how deliberately they'd been chosen to cost her family, nothing more than that. Pilot error. She wasn't flying home for a holiday. She was flying home to fight 6 days from now for a dead man's name. She hadn't told her grandmother any of it yet, because some things she'd decided somewhere around month 4 of building that case, you carry alone until you're completely certain of them, until the ground under the claim is solid enough that setting it down in front of someone who already survived the original loss won't just be reopening a wound for nothing. Except it wasn't only that. If she let herself be honest, which she rarely allowed herself the luxury of doing mid-thought, it was also that some part of her small, stubborn, the same part that had spent 100 Saturday nights alone in a simulator lab instead of at a party, was afraid of what it would mean if the hearing failed, if 11 months of quiet work amounted, in the end, to nothing but confirming the same 2 words all over again, this time with her grandmother watching. So she hadn't said anything, not yet. 6 more days. The gate agent, young, a lanyard, a tired smile that had clearly been worn since well before sunrise, checked her boarding pass, checked the authorization letter twice, with the specific care of someone who didn't fully understand the document, but had been instructed to respect it, and waved her through. She turned left at the jet bridge door, not right toward the cabin, left toward the cockpit. A flight attendant met her there, Noel Bishop, 41 years old, 12 years with Continental Crest, the specific brand of calm that comes only from having already survived every conceivable version of a bad day. This particular job has to offer, and having decided, somewhere around year 6, that panic was simply a service she no longer provided. "You're the observer," Noel said, "not a question." Briar Kincaid. "Captain Ferris is expecting you." She glanced at the letter once more, matched it against a clipboard, nodded. "You'll have the jump seat through initial climb. When I come get you, that means it's time to move to your assigned seat." Understood. She stepped inside. The cockpit of a 737 is smaller than people imagine. That's always the first thing anyone says, the first time they see one in person, and it was true again now. The way true things remain stubbornly true, no matter how many times you already knew them. Every surface layered in switches and displays, and the specific silent choreography of 2 people who had performed this exact sequence so many thousand times their hands had stopped waiting for their minds to finish the thought. Captain Roland Ferris was 56, 24 years with the airline, a decade before that flying transport aircraft for the Navy, and it showed in every motion he made nothing wasted, nothing rushed, the specific economy of a man who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone in a cockpit, including himself. "Kincaid," he said, reading it off the letter without turning fully around. "Sit. Don't touch anything. Ask your questions when we're level. Deal." First Officer Dana Okafor gave her a brief nod, without breaking stride through the departure checklist, her voice low and cadenced, the specific music of procedure Briar had heard 1,000 times in a simulator, and only twice before in actual flight. There was something steadying in it, a ritual older than any single person performing it, passed down cockpit to cockpit, the way certain kinds of knowledge only ever pass hand to hand, voice to voice, never fully written down anywhere, that could capture the whole of it. Briar settled the small fold-down jump seat into position, strapped in, and opened her notebook. Not because anyone had told her to, because this was simply what she did in any cockpit. She was permitted to sit in. She documented. She wrote things into the margins of her own understanding, the way her grandfather used to write into the margins of flight manuals. He read purely for the pleasure of it, and the way her mother, gone 11 years now, a separate grief entirely, folded carefully, and kept somewhere else, used to say that some people relaxed with novels on a Sunday afternoon, and some people relaxed with wiring diagrams, and there was no shame whatsoever in being the second kind of person. The aircraft pushed back from the gate at 9:14, lifted off the runway at 9:22, 6 minutes ahead of schedule, and Cedar Ridge fell away beneath them, the grid of streets, the brown October fields stitched together with fence lines, the pale ribbon of a 2-lane highway running somewhere it needed to go. Briar watched it disappear, the way she always watched it disappear, and felt what she always felt in that exact moment. Every single time, without exception. Not fear. Not excitement either, though people always assumed one or the other. Something quieter than both. Something that felt, if she allowed herself to be honest about it, like coming home to a version of herself that never once had to explain herself to anyone. 600 miles east and slightly north, in a kitchen rearranged so many times over 4 decades that everything had finally settled into exactly the place it was always meant to occupy. Lorraine Kincaid was making tea. She was 74. Her hair had gone fully white sometime in her early 60s, and she'd decided, with the specific finality she brought to most decisions, that she liked it that way. Her hands showed the years plainly, hands that had held a feverish child through a long night, bread every Sunday morning for longer than she could easily count anymore, planted bulbs every October, whether or not she'd still be there to see them bloom for the following spring. But steady, always steady. Age had taken plenty from Lorraine Kincaid. It had never once taken that. On the kitchen table, beside a folded newspaper and a pair of reading glasses, sat a tablet, its screen showing a small blue airplane icon that had just lifted off from Cedar Ridge and was tracking northeast. Continental Crest 1147, Briar's flight. Lorraine carried her tea to the table and positioned the tablet where she could watch it without straining her eyes. She had done this for a long time now. It started back in 1988, before apps existed, before the internet existed in any form that mattered, back when there was only a base telephone, and a very particular telephone and particular kind of waiting that military families understood in a way that never needed explaining to anyone who hadn't lived inside it themselves. Her husband Emmett had been a careful man, a precise one, the kind of pilot who read technical manuals the way other people read mystery novels for entertainment, and who could, in the middle of an entirely ordinary dinner, suddenly mention something about the weather 2 states over that nobody else at the table had noticed forming yet. He'd passed that quality down, not through anything he ever said, directly through everything he simply was, moving quietly through the family's blood the way certain things move, invisible for years, until they finally surface in a granddaughter, in the exact tilt of her head, when she's thinking hardest about something she isn't ready to say out loud yet. Lorraine didn't talk about Emmett often, not because it hurt to speak of him, or not only because it hurt, because she had never been entirely certain of the whole story, and Lorraine Kincaid did not, as a matter of lifelong practice, talk about things she wasn't sure of. What she knew was this. In September, 20 years before this particular Tuesday, Emmett Kincaid had gone up on a scheduled test flight out of a base in New Mexico. He did not come back. The official report cited an instrument failure. It said he had been unable to reach the runway in time. What the report never said, what no official document connected to that day had ever said, in 20 years of Lorraine asking, was why the instruments failed in the first place. There had been a name once, mentioned in a document she was never supposed to have seen, left where she'd find it by someone who never identified themselves and never came forward again. Gideon Thorne, Regional Flight Control, Southwest Sector. She had asked twice through official channels. She had received 2 identical non-answers, worded so similarly she'd wondered, briefly and uncharitably, whether the same person had drafted them both. After that, she stopped asking. She raised her daughter. She moved to Brookhaven. She watched her granddaughter grow into someone with Emmett's exact eyes, and Emmett's exact habit of going quiet precisely when she was thinking hardest. And she opened her tablet every single time Briar flew, not because she expected something to go wrong, because it made her feel, in some small and unprovable way, like she was there. At 9:51, the little blue icon slowed its updates. Lorraine noticed. Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have assumed a glitch, a server delay, the ordinary hiccup of a system that mostly, reliably worked. But Lorraine had been watching aircraft data long enough, first through a base radio, then through early tracking software, now through an app her granddaughter had installed for her 2 Christmases ago, patiently, twice, because the first attempt hadn't taken, to know precisely what a normal gap looked like. This wasn't normal. A normal gap corrected itself within a minute or 2. The icon jumped forward slightly to catch up, the way a video buffers and then resumes. This icon had simply stopped. Altitude frozen at 31,000 feet. Speed frozen at 284 knots. Timestamp reading 9:51, and it was now 9:56. 5 minutes. Lorraine set down her tea. She called the airline. The first representative put her on hold for what felt considerably longer than the 2 minutes the automate system had promised her. the second representative, told her the flight was showing as on time in their system, and that data delays were common and rarely meant anything at all. The third, a voice trained specifically, deliberately, to soothe worried family members without ever quite lying to them, told her there was no indication of anything irregular with Flight 1147, and would she like to be transferred to arrivals information instead. Lorraine thanked her, hung up, sat very still at her kitchen table for a moment longer than she usually allowed herself to sit still for anything. She knew what irregular felt like. She had lived through it once already, and the body remembers these particular things. Even when the mind insists, reasonably, patiently, on staying calm, there is a specific quality to the silence that follows a call like that. Lorraine recognized it instantly, the way you recognize a smell from very early childhood, long before you have language for why it means what it means. She got up, went to the front hallway, took her coat down from its hook, the gray wool one she wore to church, to the doctor, to anything at all that required her to show up properly and be counted on. Picked up her keys, didn't call anyone to tell them where she was going, didn't stop to write a note, though some part of her, moving through the hallway, noted that she should probably have left one and decided against it anyway. She locked the door behind her, walked to her car, a 14-year-old sedan, spotless inside and out, maintained less out of necessity and more out of a certain respect for things that had served her faithfully for a long time, and started driving northeast toward Brookhaven Municipal, the smaller regional airport, 20 minutes from her house, printed nowhere on Briar's actual ticket. She didn't know yet why she was going there. Instead of the larger airport her granddaughter's flight was actually scheduled to land at. She just knew she needed to be closer, back on Flight 1147. Briar had returned to her assigned seat at 9:41, 19 minutes in the cockpit, her allotted time, and she'd used every second of it. Watching Ferris and Okafor work through the climb phase with the specific ease that comes only from doing something 10,000 times until it stops resembling effort at all. She'd filled 6 pages of her notebook already. Small, precise handwriting crowding the margins the way it always did once she got going. She'd noticed something too. At 30,000 feet over western Kansas, a brief patch of chop, the kind of light turbulence, entirely unremarkable on this particular route in October, the kind most passengers register only as a mild inconvenience to their coffee. Most people grab an armrest, without even fully waking up to the fact that they've grabbed it. Okafor had made one small adjustment to their altitude to climb above the layer, and Briar had watched the timing of it with real attention, the angle of the input, the way she'd taken her hand back from the controls, a half second before most pilots would have, trusting the aircraft to finish the correction on its own. She'd filed it away. That was simply what she did with everything she watched. Now she sat back in 14C, aisle seat, the window seat beside her, lucky and empty, on an otherwise mostly full flight. Her textbook closed on her lap because there wasn't much left in it. She hadn't already committed twice over to memory. The man in 14A had been in his seat since before she'd boarded late, in fact, right at the final call, carrying only a single black bag he'd stowed under the seat in front of him, rather than in the overhead bin, the way people do when they want something within immediate reach and don't want to explain why. He appeared to be sleeping, head angled toward the window, eyes closed. Briar had noticed him the way she noticed weather patterns and instrument readings, catalogued, filed, set aside, moved on. He'd declined the coffee service without opening his eyes at all. She'd registered that too, filed it beside the rest, and gone back to her notes. At 9:51, she looked up from the page in front of her. She didn't know why. She would never afterward be able to explain it in any way that sounded reasonable to anyone who hadn't been there. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't anything she could have pointed to on a checklist. It was more like the way a room changes. The instant someone leaves it some subtle rearrangement of the air that the body registers a full beat before the mind catches up and starts asking questions. She looked toward the front of the cabin. The cockpit door sat closed, same as always. Everything looked ordinary. Something wasn't. She turned back to her notebook. Read the same line 3 times in a row. Couldn't hold on to a single word of it. Then the cockpit door opened. Noelle Bishop stepped out. Her face was arranged carefully, the very specific arrangement people practice for exactly the moment when something has gone wrong and they've been trained, at length, not to show it plainly. Briar had seen that particular arrangement before, on the faces of doctors crossing waiting rooms toward families who already suspected the worst, before a single word had been spoken. Noelle said something low to the second flight attendant near the galley. Then she stepped back inside the cockpit. 15 seconds later, the cabin intercom clicked on. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your lead flight attendant. We ask that all passengers please fasten your seatbelts at this time and remain seated. A pause. Barely a full second. We're asking everyone to remain seated until further notice. Thank you. That was the entire announcement. No mention of turbulence. No reassurance offered in either direction. The cabin absorbed it, the way cabins always absorb this kind of silence, first in stillness, then in low murmurs traveling row to row, then in one man near the back saying, loudly enough for half the aircraft to hear him clearly, "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Briar was already unbuckling her belt. She didn't run, she didn't need to. She rose with the exact deliberate calm of someone who has already decided precisely what she's going to do next, and is simply now doing it. She retrieved the authorization letter from her seat pocket, folded it once along its existing crease, tucked it into her jacket pocket, and started walking forward. A younger flight attendant, visibly shaken, stepped into the aisle in front of her. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. We need all passengers to. I need to speak with Noelle. I was in that cockpit 30 minutes ago. I have federal authorization for this flight. Get her. Right now." Something in the exact tone of that made the younger woman step aside without further argument. Noelle appeared from the galley. Her eyes found Briar's face and held there a half-second longer than they'd needed to, and something behind them shifted. Not relief, not yet. A recalculation. "Both pilots?" Briar said quietly, not really a question. Noelle hesitated for the length of a single held breath. "Both, we think it's the crew meal. Same catering prep for both trays. Autopilot status engaged. Current altitude and heading." Noelle hesitated again. Longer this time, and Briar understood exactly what that hesitation was made. Of the most senior person still standing on this aircraft being asked, in real time, to absorb that the single most qualified person available to her had been sitting in coach 20 minutes earlier in a plain black shirt, with no visible rank or credential. 31,000 feet. Heading 095. Briar ran the math instantly, the way the math had run itself for years, without her needing to consciously invite it. Roughly 90 minutes from Brookhaven's controlled airspace. Fuel wasn't yet a concern, not at this stage. The autopilot would hold them stable for the immediate future. For now. "I need to go in there. You're a flight instructor." "That's not the same as." "I'm an FAA certified observer on this exact aircraft type, cleared by both Continental Crest and the federal government. I have over 2,000 hours on this airframe in simulation, and command time on comparable transport aircraft during my service. I know that cockpit." She held Noelle's gaze without blinking, without raising her voice even slightly. "And right now, I am the most qualified person you have on this airplane." Behind them, the noise from the cabin was climbing steadily. Noelle looked once more at the letter in Briar's hand, looked at Briar's face, then stepped aside. The cockpit smelled different now. 30 minutes ago it had smelled like coffee and warm electronics and the specific clean, thin air of high altitude. Now it smelled like something had gone badly wrong, in a very small enclosed space, sweat, and something else underneath it that Briar didn't let herself name yet. Captain Ferris sat slumped forward, held upright only by his harness, his face gray, his breathing shallow but unmistakably present. First Officer Okafor had slid sideways in her seat, head resting against the window, also breathing, also unresponsive. The autopilot display read ingaged, altitude 31,000 feet. Heading 095, airspeed 281 knots, stable, for now. Briar stepped over the threshold and took in the cockpit the exact way she'd been trained to take in any flight environment, in any crisis, systematically left to right, top to bottom, nothing skipped, nothing assumed. She was not, in this moment, thinking about how serious any of this was. She was processing data, the way she had practiced, doing hundreds of times in a simulator lab, until it stopped feeling like practice at all, and simply became the specific texture of how her mind operated under pressure. She sat down in the right seat, the first officer's position, which felt, in the split second, she considered it, more appropriate than displacing the captain from his own chair, even in his current condition and strapped in. Her hands were steady. That was the detail she would return to later, turning it over and over in her mind long after the flight had ended. Not the instruments, not the radio, her hands. She had genuinely expected them to shake. They didn't. She put on the headset. Cedar Ridge approach. This is Continental Crest, 1147. I need a senior controller immediately. Continental Crest, 1147. This is Cedar Ridge. State the nature of your request. Both pilots on this aircraft are incapacitated. I'm a certified flight instructor and FAA authorized observer on this flight. I'm currently in the cockpit. Silence on the line. 3 seconds. 4. Confirm. You are stating both flight crew are incapacitated. Confirmed. Captain Ferris and First Officer Okafor, both unconscious. Believed food-related. Both breathing. Autopilot engaged. Level at 31,000, heading 095, airspeed 281. Another pause. Shorter this time. Standby 1147. Briar used the seconds to continue her scan. Engines reading nominal across every parameter. Fuel adequate for the moment. She filed the exact figure away to monitor closely as time passed. Autopilot holding altitude and heading precisely the way it was designed to. Doing its quiet, invisible job the way it had likely done 10,000 uneventful times before this one. A new voice came through, replacing the first. Older, slower. The unmistakable voice of a man who had spent decades making decisions under pressure and had long since stopped needing to sound urgent in order to be taken seriously. 1147. This is Gideon Thorne, Senior Controller, Cedar Ridge Center. I'm told you have a situation. That's correct. What's your name? Briar Kincaid, Flight Instructor, Civilian Training, out of Millbrook, Ohio. Former Air Force. A pause she couldn't quite read the shape of yet. Kincaid, he said slowly, how familiar are you with the 737? Over 2,000 hours simulator time on this exact variant. I was seated in this cockpit as an authorized observer until roughly 0941 local. I know the layout thoroughly. You've never flown the real aircraft. No. But I know precisely how it flies. What's the difference? Quick answer. Feedback. Control inputs feel considerably heavier in the real airframe than in simulation. I've been told to add roughly 10% to my expected control pressure. Then, told by whom? My grandfather. A longer pause this time. The kind of pause that carries a weight it hasn't fully earned the right to yet. It hasn't fully earned the right to yet. And both of them seem to sense it arriving from opposite ends of the frequency at exactly the same moment. Your last name is Kincaid. Yes, your grandfather. Was he Emmett Kincaid? The question landed somewhere Briar hadn't braced for. She kept her eyes fixed on the instruments in front of her, her voice level. He was. He died 20 years ago. What came back over the radio wasn't quite silence. It was something more specific than silence. The particular sound of a man absorbing information he had, in some buried and long unexamined corner of himself, been braced to receive one day, and had never once expected to receive it delivered exactly like this, from 31,000 feet, in the middle of an emergency he hadn't asked for. I knew Emmett Kincaid, Gideon Thorne said. I know, Briar said. We can talk about that later. Right now I need you to help me get this plane to Brookhaven. A beat. Then, with something new threading into his voice, not quite warmth, not yet, but something standing close beside it, waiting its turn, copy that. Let's get to work. While Briar spoke to Cedar Ridge, Noelle Bishop had come to stand in the cockpit doorway, listening, absorbing. She had been a flight attendant for 12 years. She had handled medical emergencies, unruly passengers, a man who'd gone into cardiac arrest somewhere over Missouri 2 years back, and lived, because she'd known exactly what to do in the 90 seconds before help could reach him. She had never once handled this, but she watched this 28-year-old woman sit calmly in the first officer's chair, scan every instrument in sequence, speak to air traffic control with the exact precision of someone who had done this before, even though Noelle knew, somewhere underneath her own fear, that she absolutely had not. And Noelle made a decision in the space of about 4 seconds that would define everything she did for the rest of this flight. She was going to trust her completely. Not because there was another option available to her, because something in the specific way Briar moved and spoke and scanned those instruments told Noelle, with total certainty, that trust was the correct choice, and had been the correct choice from the moment Briar stepped over that threshold. Noelle turned back into the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, and her voice had steadied considerably from whatever it had been 30 seconds earlier. "I want to give you an honest update. Our flight crew has experienced a medical situation and is being cared for. We have an aviation professional managing the aircraft with full support from air traffic control. We are stable. We are at altitude. We are on course." A man near the back called out, loud enough to carry, "Who's flying the plane?" Noelle took one full breath before answering. "Someone who knows exactly what she's doing," she said. 12 minutes after Briar sat down in that cockpit, she found something she had not expected and was not prepared to find. She'd been working steadily through the aircraft systems alongside Gideon Thorne, methodically, by confirming each one in sequence the way they'd silently agreed to proceed without either of them saying so aloud. Engines, fuel, hydraulics, navigation, electrical, all of it reading nominal, until she reached the flight control computer's maintenance log, a page she'd learned to read the hard way during a single unglamorous Saturday afternoon years ago that most of her classmates at flight school had skipped in favor of somewhere warmer and louder. The FCC on a 700 and 37-800 is a system pilots rarely think about consciously, because when it functions correctly, it is essentially invisible, thousands of minuscule adjustments made every second, keeping an aircraft level and true without a single pilot input required. What Briar saw in the log now made her go completely still. An entry timestamped 9:47. 4 minutes before both pilots collapsed. A manual command entered directly into the flight control computer, not a system-generated adjustment, a manual input, sourced from an external connection point. External access ports exist on commercial aircraft strictly for ground maintenance purposes. They are not supposed to be reachable once an aircraft is in flight. There are locks. There are fail-safes specifically engineered to prevent exactly this. But the log showed precisely what it showed. She read the command carefully, twice, to be certain she wasn't misreading it in the adrenaline of the moment. It wasn't designed to bring the aircraft down immediately. It was subtler than that, and somehow that subtlety frightened her more than an obvious threat would have. A timed autopilot disconnect, set to trigger at 10:20, 31 minutes from the moment she found it. If the autopilot disconnected with no one at the controls, with 2 pilots unconscious, and a cabin full of frightened passengers who had no idea anything had even been engineered against them, the aircraft would begin a slow, uncommanded drift away from its assigned heading and altitude. At cruise speed at 31,000 feet, it would take somewhere between 11 and 14 minutes before that drift became genuinely serious. Another 4 to 6 minutes after that, before it became entirely unrecoverable. This was not an accident. She said it to Gideon Thorne, the exact way you say something enormously important when you are actively working to stay level. "Gideon, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish it completely before you respond." "Go ahead." "I accessed the flight control computer's maintenance log. There's a manual command entered at 0947 local. 4 minutes before crew incapacitation began. It was not entered from inside this cockpit. It came from an external access point somewhere inside the cabin itself. It's a timed autopilot disconnect, set to execute at 10:20. Silence. I heard you, he said finally. His voice hadn't shifted in any way she could detect. And that unshaken evenness told her more about the sheer depth of his experience than anything he could have said outright. What's your current time? She checked the clock in front of her. 10:09. 11 minutes. Can you cancel the command? I'm looking at it now. Give me 60 seconds. She worked through the interface, which was never designed for speed under pressure. It was built for ground technicians with a reference manual open beside them, and no clock ticking against their shoulder. She had neither of those comforts. What she had instead was muscle memory from 100 hours spent in a simulator lab that smelled permanently of burnt coffee, and the very specific, unhurried patience her grandfather had spent years teaching her without either of them ever calling it a lesson. She found the parameter, entered the cancellation sequence. Command cancelled, she said. Autopilot secure. A long breath from Gideon on the other end of the radio. Good, he said. That's very good. Kincaid, that command never once appeared on our end, on the ground. Whoever entered it knew exactly how to do it without triggering any groundside alert. This was not opportunistic. Someone on your aircraft planned this in advance. Breyer looked at the closed cockpit door. Behind it, 138 people, one of whom had done this deliberately, with real planning, and was, at this exact moment, sitting somewhere in that cabin, as though nothing at all had happened. I know, she said quietly. She thought immediately of the man in 14A, gray jacket, boarded late, single bag stowed under the seat instead of the overhead bin, eyes that hadn't been quite as closed as sleeping eyes are usually closed. I need you to do something on the ground side, Gideon. Quietly. Nothing broadcast on a channel any passenger might be monitoring on a personal device. Tell me. Full passenger manifest. Run it against whatever databases you have access to. I need to know if anyone aboard this aircraft has a documented background in avionics, flight control systems, or aerospace engineering. A pause. You have someone specific in mind. I'm not making an accusation yet. I'm being systematic about it. She could hear something shift in the silence that followed, the sound of Gideon Thorne quietly deciding something, on his end of the line, that he wasn't ready to say out loud just yet either. You sound like someone I used to know, he said. She didn't answer that directly, not yet. There was still too much directly in front of her that required her full attention, and she was not, by nature or by training, a person who allowed herself to feel something fully before it was safe to feel it. Outside the windscreen, the sky ahead remained clear for the moment, but on the radar display, 60 miles out, a weather system was already building over the plains, the kind of system that made the Kansas to Missouri corridor genuinely complicated in October, sudden and heavy and entirely indifferent to the very specific human crisis currently unfolding. Inside this one aluminum tube moving directly toward it, Brian noted it, filed it, added it to the list. There was a great deal on the list now. She worked through each item the way her grandfather had once taught her, the way every good pilot is taught, whether or not they ever consciously realize they're being taught it at all. One thing at a time, in order, and the rest could wait its turn. Meanwhile, in row 16B, a woman named Sylvia Marrow had been quietly watching the man in 14A for several minutes with a stillness that came directly from 22 years as a federal agent before her retirement 4 years earlier. Gray bob. Reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She was flying to Brookhaven because her sister was recovering from hip surgery and needed a ride home, nothing more dramatic than that. Or so she had believed when she'd boarded this morning. She had noticed Desmond Vale, though she didn't yet have his name the moment she'd boarded. Not dramatically, just the way her mind still did, out of pure habit, exactly what it had been trained for 2 decades to do without her ever consciously requesting it. Catalogued, compared, flagged for no immediate reason beyond a pattern that felt somehow slightly wrong. The late boarding, the single under-seat bag instead of an overhead one, the way he'd checked the seatback pocket, and both nearby exit rows, the instant he sat down, the subtle orientation of a person managing an environment rather than simply occupying a seat inside it. Sylvia knew precisely what that looked like, because she had done exactly the same thing herself, on every single flight, for 22 straight years. When the intercom announcement came through Kincaid managing this aircraft, Sylvia made her decision without any further deliberation. She unbuckled her belt, walked 3 rows forward to where Noel Bishop was still moving through the cabin checking seatbelts, and said quietly, "I'm a retired federal agent. I have carry authorization. I believe you have a problem in 14 Alpha that's considerably bigger than 2 sick pilots." Noel looked at her for one long second. "Come with me," she said. 2 rows behind that exchange, a man named Owen Prescott, 67 years old, 31 years, a cardiothoracic surgeon before retirement, currently kneeling beside the forward galley, checking. Captain Ferris's pulse looked up and caught Noel's eye across the cabin. She gave him a small, deliberate nod. He returned his attention to his patient, hands entirely steady, the specific steadiness that only ever arrives after 31 years of learning precisely what steady is supposed to look like when the moment genuinely calls for it. At 10:14, Gideon's voice returned, careful now in a new way, the specific carefulness of a man weighing exactly how much to say and when. "Kincaid, the manifest is still running against the databases. I want you focused on the weather ahead in the meantime. It's building faster than this morning's forecast anticipated." "Understood. Give me everything you have on it." He did, cold air pushing down out of the north, colliding overnight with warmer, moisture-heavy air moving up out of the Gulf, a collision that had been quietly assembling itself over the plains since well before dawn, invisible to anyone, not specifically watching the right instruments in exactly the right way. By mid-morning, it had stacked itself into something genuinely significant, not catastrophic, but serious, in the particular way October weather over open country is often seriously unpredictable, sudden heavy, and poorly timed for an aircraft that could not simply choose a different day to fly through it. Breyer absorbed the information, filed it against the fuel numbers already running quietly in the back of her mind, and said nothing for a moment, because there was a version of this morning, she found herself thinking, unbidden, in the half-second gap between one instrument check and the next, that looked almost exactly like an ordinary Tuesday, a woman boarding a flight, a folder of paperwork, a hearing 6 days away that she still hadn't told anyone about. Until it wasn't ordinary at all. Until the whole shape of the day had turned inside out, in less time than it takes to finish a cup of coffee, and she was sitting in a stranger's seat, flying a stranger's airplane, with a stranger's life, 138 of them, in fact resting on whatever she did next. She set the thought down. "There wasn't room for it yet. Gideon," she said. "I need one more thing from you, when you have a moment. Not urgent, just when you have a moment. Go ahead. If anything happens to me on this flight, I need someone to know there's a hearing scheduled in 6 days. Federal Aviation Records Board. Case file under Kincaid. My grandmother doesn't know about it yet. If something happens, I need someone to make sure it doesn't just disappear with me." There was a pause on the line long enough that she wondered if she'd said too much, too soon, to a man she'd known for barely 20 minutes. "Nothing is going to happen to you," Gideon said finally. "But I've written it down. Case file, Kincaid. I won't forget it, thank you. Now let's get back to work." 700 miles west and slightly south, a gray sedan moved steadily through the outskirts of Brookhaven, heading toward the municipal airport with a specific, unhurried urgency that would have looked, to anyone watching from outside, entirely at odds with itself. Lorraine Kincaid drove with both hands on the wheel, the radio off, listening instead to something else entirely, the particular silence of knowing before you know, a silence she had felt once before, decades ago, and had promised herself, somewhere in all the years since, that she would never again be the last to arrive. She wasn't going to be late this time, she thought. Driving, about a summer afternoon, more than 20 years gone now, a granddaughter barely 7 years old, lifted up to a kitchen window during a rolling thunderstorm, small hands pressed flat against the glass. Grandpa. What does the lightning look like from inside the cloud? He'd laughed. The real laugh. The one that came from somewhere entirely true and unguarded, like being inside something alive. Lorraine had believed, at the time, that it was simply a thing grandfathers said to 7-year-olds to make thunder feel like a story instead of a threat. She understood now, all these years later, driving toward an airport she had no ticket for and no official reason to be near, that he had meant it exactly as literally as it had sounded. She kept driving, both hands steady on the wheel, guided by nothing she could put into words, for anyone who might ask her to explain it, and needing, for the first time, in longer than she could remember, absolutely nothing to explain it to anyone at all, because somewhere ahead of her, on a runway she hadn't yet identified, her granddaughter was flying toward her, and she intended to be standing there, exactly on time, when she came down. The turbulence hadn't started yet, but the cabin could feel it coming the way certain rooms feel a storm before a single drop of rain falls anywhere near them. A pressure, change, nobody names out loud. A stillness that isn't calm so much as held breath. Because there's a lag, a gap between when a threat gets contained and when the body finally believes it's actually over. And in exactly that gap, the 4 seconds after the initial shock of 2 collapsed pilots had settled into something almost manageable, Desmond Vale made his decision. Nobody saw him decide it. That was, in the end, the entire design of him. 11 years sent building systems meant to work invisibly. Systems nobody ever noticed until the precise moment they failed, and he brought that exact same instinct to himself now. He didn't lunge, he didn't announce anything. He simply unbuckled his belt during the one window. Nobody was fully watching him. Because Noelle Bishop was 3 rows forward, bracing a woman who had started crying quietly into both hands, and because Sylvia Marrow had turned her head half an inch too far toward the aisle, tracking a service cart that hadn't actually been wheeled anywhere near her. And he stood up, quiet, controlled, a man simply walking to the lavatory. That's precisely what it looked like, for exactly as long as it needed to look like that, except the lavatory was behind him, and he was walking forward. Sylvia caught the motion in her peripheral vision a half-second later than she should have, which had never happened to her before, not once in 22 years. That half-second cost her the clean intercept she would otherwise have had, and so instead of stopping him cleanly in the aisle, she was still 3 feet behind him. When he reached the cockpit door and pressed his palm flat against it, testing it as though it might simply yield to the sheer force of his wanting it to, it didn't open. Because Breyer had locked it the instant she'd sat down. Because that was procedure. Because some quiet part of her, the same part that had clocked a man's eyes not quite fully closed, the moment she had first sat beside him had already been braced for exactly this, before she'd had a name to attach to the threat. Sir. Noelle's voice, sharp now, closing the distance fast. Sir, you need to sit back down. He didn't answer her. He was still looking at the door, and there was something in the particular stillness of his shoulders that Owen Prescott recognized immediately from 31 years spent watching bodies in crisis, because bodies in genuine crisis do one of exactly 2 things. They shake. Or they go perfectly, terribly still, the way a body goes still directly before it commits to something it will not be able to take back afterward. This was the second kind. Get away from that door, Sylvia said. Not loud. Loud would only have detonated the entire cabin at once. She kept her voice low, flat, the exact register she had used 100 times before, walking calmly toward people who were about to do something irreversible. Now Vale turned his head, only his head, and for the first time, since the flight had begun, everything Breyer had already privately assessed about him composed. Watching, the wrong kind of calm met his actual face directly, and what looked back wasn't panic at all. It was disappointment. The specific, clipped disappointment of a man whose calculations had failed, infuriatingly, to account for one single variable, and who was already 3 full steps into quietly revising the entire plan behind his eyes. "I need to speak with the pilot," he said. Reasonable, measured, the exact voice of a man who had spent an entire career convincing rooms full of engineers that his numbers, and only his numbers, were the correct ones. "There's a fuel discrepancy I can help her correct. I have relevant background." "Sit down," Sylvia said again. "I'm only trying to help. Sit down." That was when he moved, not toward her, toward the door again. One more test of the handle, his shoulder dropping into it, with genuine weight behind it this time, and the sound that produced metal against metal. A door engineered specifically to withstand exactly this kind of pressure, refusing to yield a single inch, was the sound that finally cracked the cabin's fragile quiet wide open. Someone screamed, which set off someone else immediately, which set off the precise chain reaction that happens inside enclosed spaces. Once fear finally finds its permission slip, and for 4 full seconds the aisle became a wall of standing bodies and raised voices, and a woman near row 12 saying, "Oh God, oh God, oh God," on a loop that didn't seem to require her to breathe between repetitions of it. Owen Prescott moved first. 31 years in trauma bays had taught him precisely one lesson above all the others: that hesitation kills more people than a wrong decision ever does. And he crossed the distance from his aisle seat to row 14 in under 2 seconds, got his forearm across Vale's chest, and used the specific leverage of a much larger, considerably older man, who had spent 3 full decades learning exactly where a human body's balance actually lives. "Sit," Owen said. "Just that, not a threat, a statement of fact." Vale twisted, got one hand free, and for one dangerously suspended half-second, it genuinely looked like it might go wrong, might become the kind of physical struggle that ends with somebody's skull against a bulkhead, until Sylvia closed the final 3 feet and did something quick and precise with his free wrist that made his entire arm go rigid and useless, in a way that had nothing whatsoever to do with strength and everything to do with 22 years of knowing exactly where a joint gives. "On the ground," she said. "Now, or I dislocate this shoulder and you spend the remainder of this flight in more pain than you've ever experienced. Your choice entirely." He went down, not gracefully, knees first, then the rest of him, Owen's forearm still braced firmly across his back, Sylvia's grip locked at an angle that left absolutely no room for negotiation, and the whole sequence took perhaps 11 seconds from the first shoulder against the cockpit door to Vale, lying face down on the floor of a commercial aircraft, with a retired federal agent's knee planted squarely between his shoulder blades. Inside the cockpit, Breyer heard every single second of it through a door that blocked entry far better than it blocked sound. "Gideon." Her voice didn't rise. That was already becoming the thing Gideon Thorne noticed about her. The way you notice a pattern in a person before you've found language for the pattern itself. She got quieter, not louder, exactly when things got worse. "Someone just tried the cockpit door. Kincaid?" "He's down. Passengers have him contained. I need you to stay with me on this, because I can't see what's happening back there, and right now I need eyes that I trust more than my own imagination. Talk to your cabin crew. I'm right here." She keyed the intercom handset instead. Her thumb didn't shake at all. She noticed that, the same detached way she'd noticed her own steady hands earlier. A small observation floating just outside the panic she wasn't allowing herself to feel yet, because feeling it now would have cost her the one thing she genuinely couldn't afford to lose: precision. "Noel, status," a beat. Then Noel's voice, breathless but level. "He's restrained. 2 passengers have him. He's not getting back up. Injuries? None visible." Good. One word, carrying the full weight of an entire exhale she didn't have time to actually take. "Keep him there. There will be federal agents waiting when we land." "Copy that." She clicked off. Both hands returned to the yoke, because the aircraft hadn't stopped needing her, simply because something else had needed her for 11 seconds. And outside the windscreen, the leading edge of the storm system was already visible, gray and enormous and entirely indifferent, exactly the way it had been the entire flight so far. Gideon's voice returned, careful now, in the specific register of a man choosing his words with real deliberation. Kincaid, that man just confirmed everything you already suspected. I know, he's not going to talk his way out of this. I know that too. A pause. Then, quieter, in the version of her voice reserved for the things she hadn't planned on saying aloud at all. I need you to run something else, not the manifest. His employer. Whoever he worked for prior to the termination on record. I want to know who benefits from a commercial aircraft going down over open plains instead of landing safely. Silence on the line. Long enough that she nearly repeated herself. You think this goes further than him? Gideon said. I think a man doesn't build a disconnect this clean, this quiet, for purely personal reasons. Personal reasons tend to be messy. This wasn't messy. This was engineered. She watched the altimeter hold rock steady. Someone paid for precision like that. Gideon didn't answer right away, and in the gap where his answer should have arrived, Briar found herself doing the exact thing she'd promised herself she wouldn't do mid-flight, thinking about the hearing. 6 days away now. A conference room somewhere with fluorescent lighting, nearly identical to Cedar Ridge's, and a folder 11 months in the making. And 2 words, 2 decades old, that had trailed her family everywhere they'd gone since. Pilot error. Because that was the thing nobody warned you about: grief, shaped like an official government document. It didn't soften the way ordinary grief eventually softens. It calcified instead. Sat in a drawer for 20 years, getting harder, not gentler, until finally someone had both the credentials and the stubbornness required to pry the whole thing back open. She was that someone. She'd built the case mostly alone. In evenings, after her last student had gone home for the day, requested records through channels that had stalled her for months at a time. Cross-referenced maintenance logs from a base that had technically stopped operating under that name a decade earlier. Found 2 retired technicians willing to speak, off the record, about a navigation relay flaw that no official document had ever confirmed in writing. And in 6 days, she was supposed to stand in front of a federal review board and argue that a dead man deserved better than the 2 words history had settled on giving him. She hadn't told Lorraine any of it yet, which was its own particular kind of cowardice, if she allowed herself to call it that plainly. And mostly she didn't allow herself, because there had never been a version of that conversation that didn't sound, in her head, like reopening a wound her grandmother had spent 2 full decades carefully learning to live around. Except now there was a man restrained on the floor of coach, with a documented background in flight control systems, and a job he'd lost 8 years earlier under circumstances the federal government had quietly closed without ever explaining why, and something about that particular shape technical expertise, quiet dismissal, a buried inquiry that went nowhere, sat far too close to the shape of her grandfather's own file for it to feel like coincidence anymore. She didn't say any of that to Gideon. Not yet. It wasn't a fact yet. It was only a feeling, and feelings didn't belong on this frequency, not while there was still 138 lives resting on the numbers in front of her. Kincaid. Gideon's voice again, careful. The employer information is going to take real time to come back. I've got a request already filed. In the meantime, talk to me about your fuel. Back to the list. Good. She needed the list. Adequate for now. I want a complete picture on weather and runway options before we're 40 minutes out. Copy that. Give me 10 minutes. 600 miles east, Lorraine Kincaid pulled into the small lot at Brookhaven Municipal and sat behind the wheel with the engine off, hands still gripping it the exact way they'd gripped it for the last 20 minutes of driving, because some part of her hadn't fully trusted her own legs yet to carry the rest of her anywhere useful. She didn't know why she'd come here instead of the larger airport printed on Briar's actual ticket 40 minutes further on. There wasn't a version of that decision that made any sense on paper, but paper had never once been where Lorraine kept the things that truly mattered to her. Paper was for other people's certainty. Hers lived somewhere lower down, somewhere older, in the part of her that had learned 40 years ago to trust a very specific silence, far more than she trusted any spoken fact handed to her by a stranger on a phone. Her tablet offered no new information at all, just the same frozen frame of a blue icon that hadn't moved in over half an hour now, altitude and speed locked at numbers that meant nothing to her, except that they weren't changing, and a small update timestamp that fell further and further behind real time. With every minute she sat there in that parking lot, she turned the car radio on instead. Static first, then a local station, the kind that ran farm reports at dawn, and high school football scores in the evening, its midday anchor delivering something now with the careful, measured urgency of a person reporting a genuine developing situation while working very hard not to manufacture panic where none had been officially confirmed. Developing story out of the region this morning. We're told a commercial flight bound for Brookhaven experienced what's being described as a medical emergency involving both flight crew members. Air traffic control has confirmed ongoing contact with the aircraft, and initial reports indicate an off-duty aviation professional aboard the flight has taken control. Lorraine's hand found her own chest, without her ever consciously deciding to put it there. Unconfirmed reports identify this individual as Briar Kincaid, a certified flight instructor believed to be a former U.S. Air Force pilot. The rest of the sentence didn't fully register, not because the radio had stopped producing words, because Lorraine had stopped, entirely, being able to hear anything past her own granddaughter's name coming out of a stranger's mouth on a car radio, in an unfamiliar parking lot, and for one long, suspended moment the only thing available to her was to sit perfectly still and let it land all the way through her. Then she took her hand away from her chest. She looked through the windshield at the small terminal building, its single gate, its modest tower, its handful of parked regional aircraft that had nothing at all to do with the flight in question, and everything to do with the fact that this was apparently precisely where she was meant to be sitting. She had known, in some plainer and older sense, that the sky was always where Briar had been heading. From the exact summer afternoon, Emmett had lifted a 7-year-old up to the kitchen window during a rolling storm, and let her watch lightning tear the horizon open like something genuinely alive. "Grandpa, what does it look like from inside the cloud?" He'd laughed, the real laugh, the one that came from somewhere entirely true. Like being inside something alive. She got out of the car. Back on the aircraft, Sylvia Marrow had secured Desmond Vale's wrists, using a set of restraints pulled from the aircraft's emergency kit, the kind meant for exactly this scenario and never once used in Noel's 12 years of service, and moved him into a window seat 3 rows back from where he'd started, a flight attendant stationed directly across the aisle with clear instructions to say absolutely nothing to him, and watch every single thing he did. He hadn't spoken since he'd gone down, not one word, which told Sylvia considerably more than a confession would have, because guilty men who talked were usually still working some angle, and guilty men who went completely silent had generally already run out of angles worth working. She crouched beside Owen Prescott in the galley, both of them keeping their voices low enough that the surrounding rows couldn't catch anything over the ambient engine noise. "He's not going to give us anything," she said. "Not until there's a lawyer standing in front of him." "He didn't need to give us anything," Owen said. The woman in that cockpit already found what mattered most. Sylvia glanced toward the front of the cabin, toward the closed cockpit door, toward the particular quality of quiet that had settled back over the aircraft in the last several minutes. Not calm exactly, not yet, but something standing close beside calm. The specific hush of 138 strangers who had just watched 3 of their own subdue a genuine threat with nothing but their bare hands, and were now sitting with the knowledge of it in their laps, like something too large to hold and far too important to simply set back down. "I want 2 minutes with her on the radio," Sylvia said. "Before we land. I want to walk through exactly what she found in that flight computer, in order, so my statement lines up cleanly with hers the moment federal agents start asking questions on the ground." "You think this goes further than him?" "I think a man doesn't build something that's surgical without someone else paying for the surgery." She straightened her jacket. the small, habitual gesture of a woman settling back into a posture she'd worn professionally for 22 years and had never fully managed to unlearn since. "Get me on the radio." Noel carried the handset to the cockpit door, knocked twice the signal they'd agreed on, and Breyer's voice came through a moment later. "Go ahead." "Sylvia Marrow. Retired federal agent, 22 years. I'm in the cabin. One, he's restrained and secure. I need to walk through your timeline so it matches mine once we're on the ground." Breyer gave it to her cleanly, in sequence the timestamp on the meal service, the 4-minute window before the manual command appeared, the exact language of the disconnect, the external access point Vale would have needed to reach before the meals were served and re-seal afterward, without leaving obvious marks. Under the floor panel, Sylvia said, "Row 7, if this airframe matches the layout I'm thinking of." "How do you know that?" "I don't. I'm asking." "You're right," Breyer said. "Row 7, starboard side." He'd have needed roughly a 20-minute window before service to access it, set the command, reseal it, and get back to his own seat without drawing attention. That's a tight window on a boarding aircraft. It's tight. It's not impossible for someone who planned it well in advance and knew precisely what he was doing. Sylvia was quiet for a second. "Kincaid, I want you to keep flying. I'll handle the cabin. You focus entirely on getting us down safely. Can you trust me to manage that?" A pause. Breyer's voice, when it came, carried something in it that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. Not quite relief. Something closer to the specific loosening that happens the instant a weight gets genuinely shared, instead of carried entirely alone. "Yes," she said. "But I need to know the moment it becomes a problem again." "You'll know," Sylvia said, "because I'll be louder than the engines." A brief silence on the line. Then Gideon's voice, who had apparently been listening the whole time from his console 600 miles away. "I believe her," he said. Sylvia carried the handset back to Noel, without another word, satisfied, and returned to her seat with the specific quiet efficiency of someone whose job was, for the moment, genuinely finished. At 10:52, Gideon Thorne came back on the cockpit frequency with news that reshaped everything ahead of them. "Kincaid, I need to update you on landing options." "Go ahead." "Cedar Ridge International is out. Weather's pushed the entire approach corridor into minimums. Nobody wants to test with an aircraft in your current condition. And there's an unrelated ground stop affecting 2 of the 3 usable runways. I've been working the alternates for the last 15 minutes. Tell me what you've got." "Lakemont Regional, 40 miles short of Brookhaven proper. Smaller field than what you trained on, shorter runway. But it's clear. It's available right now. And it puts you on the ground roughly 12 minutes sooner than fighting your way into Cedar Ridge's weather would." Breyer didn't answer immediately. She was already running the numbers the way she'd been trained to run them, the way that had stopped feeling like a separate mental step years ago and had simply become the underlying texture of how she thought under pressure. "Runway length," she said, 6,200 feet. Minimum for this airframe at normal landing weight, with a fully competent crew, sits somewhere around 55 to 6,000, depending on conditions. She said it flatly. "The way you state a fact you've already decided not to let frighten you. So I have margin." On paper, Gideon agreed. "In practice, your approach needs to be close to perfect. Speed on the numbers exactly. Threshold crossing precisely where it should be. No float, no long landing. Come in 5 knots hot and your stopping distance increases more than you'd expect, and your margin at the far end gets thin very fast. What's the crosswind? Manageable, nothing beyond what you've already handled in training. And the alternative? The alternative is holding here another 25 minutes, hoping Cedar Ridge's weather clears enough to risk it, aboard an aircraft with 2 unconscious pilots, a restrained passenger, 138 people, who have already been through more than enough today, and fuel that isn't unlimited." A pause. "I'm not going to tell you what to do, Kincaid. You're the one in the aircraft. That's not a rule. That's simply how this has always worked." Breyer looked at the fuel gauge, looked at the clock, looked for one suspended half-second at nothing at all, just the wide gray sky ahead of her, indifferent and enormous, the way it had been this entire flight, the way it had likely looked exactly the same. To a man flying blind over a New Mexico desert 20 years, before she was old enough to understand what that particular sentence would come to mean for her entire family. Lakemont, she said. Direct routing. I'll fly the most precise approach of my life if that's what this requires. Copy that. Something in Gideon's voice shifted subtly into a register that hadn't surfaced before, not colder. Steadier, like a man bracing himself to say something he'd been carrying for far longer than this single flight had existed. Kincaid. Before we begin the descent, there's something I think you need to know about your grandfather. Her hands stayed exactly where they were on the yoke. Her voice stayed level. Go ahead. I was his last radio contact. 20 years ago, a different sector back then. I was 36 years old. And I was the last voice Emmett Kincaid ever heard before his instruments failed completely. A pause, longer than any he'd allowed himself across the last 2 hours combined. I've known why for 20 years, he said. I never said anything. Not to the review board, not to your grandmother, not to a single living soul. Briar's grip didn't visibly tighten, but something behind her sternum did, a slow contraction that had nothing whatsoever to do with altitude or airspeed, and everything to do with a hearing 6 days away that she had told absolutely no one about. Why? She said. Just the one word. She didn't trust herself with anything more than that yet. There was a documented flaw in the navigation relay equipment on that test corridor, flagged months before his final flight, shelved because fixing it properly would have meant grounding several aircraft during a period the program couldn't afford the delay. He knew about it. He filed a written complaint 3 weeks before his last flight. It was acknowledged and quietly buried in a review process that never actually convened. He flew anyway, because he was a pilot, and that's simply what pilots do. Gideon's voice had gone rough at the edges now, in a way it hadn't once, during the previous 2 hours of active crisis management, and Briar understood, with the particular clarity that adrenaline sometimes grants you when it strips everything else away, that this single admission cost him more than the storm or the sabotage or the man, restrained in row 14, had cost either of them combined. When the instruments finally failed completely, he had a choice. He was low enough. The terrain below was open enough. He could have ejected and quite likely survived it. But there was a subdivision. Gideon went quiet. There was a subdivision. Briar said again, not really a question this time, because some part of her had known this exact shape her entire life, without ever having the specific facts to hang it on properly, had felt it in the careful way her grandmother never quite finished certain sentences about that day, had felt it in the particular silence that used to settle over family gatherings whenever anyone happened to mention New Mexico at all. He flew it another 18 minutes blind, Gideon said. Dead reckoning. No working instruments. And he put the aircraft down in open desert instead of 3 miles east where the houses were. A breath audible even through the radio static. The investigation called it pilot error, Gideon said, because acknowledging what he actually did that day would have meant acknowledging a maintenance flaw that everyone involved had already quietly agreed to forget. Briar sat with that for a moment. The aircraft held its heading steadily around her, indifferent, obedient to inputs she had stopped consciously making minutes ago, because her hands understood this particular kind of quiet the way they understood everything else that genuinely mattered. You've carried this for 20 years, she said. Yes. And you never told my grandmother. No, why? The question sat on the open frequency for 3 full seconds, long enough that Briar briefly wondered whether the connection had simply dropped. Because I was 36 years old, and I was afraid of what telling the truth would cost me, Gideon said. And I've spent 20 years telling myself it wouldn't have changed anything at all, which was never actually true. It would have changed everything. It simply wouldn't have changed anything for me specifically, and that was the part I couldn't make myself accept back then. Briar closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Only one. She didn't have more than that to spend right now. We're going to finish this conversation, she said, on the ground, all the way through, start to finish. Yes, Gideon said, we are. Good. She opened her eyes, looked at the instruments in front of her, felt something settle back into its proper place, not resolved, not remotely close to resolved yet, but finally acknowledged, which was its own kind of real progress, after 20 years of absolutely nothing. Now walk me through Lakemont's approach plates. I need everything you have on it. 600 miles away and closing fast, Lorraine Kincaid stood at a chain-link fence at the edge of Brookhaven Municipal's small public viewing area, a spot mostly used by aviation hobbyists with binoculars and retired men who came out on weekends to watch regional puddle jumpers take off and land, and realized, with a small cold drop somewhere in her stomach, that the flight she'd been waiting for wasn't coming here at all. A younger man standing beside her, phone raised, narrating quietly to someone on a call, said the word Lakemont, and Lorraine felt the entire floor of her plan shift underneath her without warning. She didn't hesitate. She'd already decided, somewhere back on that highway, that hesitations was a luxury reserved for people who hadn't already lost someone once to a runway that never got the full truth about what had actually happened on it. She got back in her car. She typed Lakemont Regional into the GPS app her granddaughter had installed for her, the same visit 2 Christmases ago that had put the flight tracker onto her tablet in the first place, and pulled back onto the road, with both hands steady on the wheel, driving now toward an airport she had never once visited in 74 years, guided by the exact same wordless certainty that had carried her all the way to Brookhaven in the first place. Because some things simply weren't logic. Some things were 40 years of paying close attention to a particular frequency between 2 people who loved each other, a frequency that had never once needed a name to be real. She turned the radio back on. The anchor's voice had shifted, updated now with fresher and more carefully confirmed details. The way local news always grows more careful with its language once a story has finally stopped being rumor and started being fact. We're now able to confirm the aircraft has been diverted to Lakemont Regional Airport, approximately 40 miles from its original destination. Federal authorities are en route to the scene. We're told the individual currently managing the aircraft, identified as Briar Kincaid, is a certified flight instructor and former Air Force pilot, who was aboard the flight in an observational capacity when the emergency first began. Lorraine's hands tightened once around the wheel, then loosened again, deliberately, because gripping it any harder wasn't going to get her there any faster, and she needed her hands steady for the driving that actually mattered now. Sources also indicate a passenger has been restrained aboard the aircraft, in connection with what authorities are now calling a possible act of deliberate sabotage. The word sabotage landed somewhere low in Lorraine's chest and stayed there, refusing to move, because that word had never once, in 20 years, been officially attached to what happened to Emmett. Instrument malfunction, pilot error, careful, bloodless phrasing chosen specifically because it foreclosed every question hiding underneath it. And here it was now, on a car radio, attached without a moment's hesitation to her own granddaughter's flight, as though the world had simply run out of patience for pretending these things were always accidents. She drove faster, not recklessly, just faster, the particular speed of a woman who has finally decided that being careful and being late are no longer compatible with one another. At 11th hour, Briar began her descent. The cockpit intercom clicked on, her voice reaching the cabin for the second time since she'd taken the controls, steady in the specific way that steadiness has to be manufactured when the alternative simply isn't an option anymore. This is Briar Kincaid. We're beginning our descent. We'll be landing at Lakemont Regional rather than our original destination. This is a planned adjustment due to weather and runway availability at Cedar Ridge. Our descent will take approximately 15 minutes. A pause. I want to be honest with you. This landing will require real precision. I'll be fully focused on flying. Our flight attendants will be available if you need anything at all. Please remain in your seats, belts fastened, for the remainder of the flight. Another pause, shorter this time. I'm going to get you down safely. I mean that completely. She set the intercom back into its cradle, looked at the fuel gauge, the wind readout, the distance to go display, counting steadily downward in a way that felt, for the very first time since she'd sat in this seat, less like a threat and considerably more like a promise. Gideon. Here, walk me through it. All of it. I want every number you have before I'm inside 10,000 feet. Runway 31 at Lakemont. 6,200 feet, asphalt, in good condition. Winds out of the southwest at 9 knots. Giving you a crosswind component of roughly 6 knots at your approach, heading manageable, well within what you've handled before. Fire and rescue are already staged and waiting. Federal agents are en route. ETK roughly 20 minutes behind your landing. Understood, Kincaid. Something careful crept back into his voice, the exact register he'd used telling her about her grandfather minutes earlier. Your grandmother has been located. Local police confirm a vehicle matching her description passed through a checkpoint near Lakemont 11 minutes ago. Briar's hands didn't move, but something behind her ribs did, sharp and sudden, the first purely emotional thing to break through the wall of procedure she'd built carefully around herself for the last 2 hours. She's coming, Briar said. Not a question. A fact finally landing somewhere. It hadn't had room to land until this exact moment. She's coming, Gideon confirmed. I don't know how she knew to head there instead of Cedar Ridge. Nobody officially told her about the diversion before local radio picked it up on their own. She didn't need anyone to tell her, Briar said quietly. She's done this before, this exact kind of waiting. She knows how to find the version of the truth nobody's confirmed yet, faster than anyone with an official channel ever manages to. Gideon didn't answer that right away, and in the silence that followed, Briar understood the way you understand something true, without a single word being spoken aloud to confirm it, that he was thinking about a different woman entirely, decades younger, standing in a different kind of waiting, receiving a different kind of silence from a radio that had gone dead instead of merely quiet. 10,000 feet, he said finally, his voice pulling itself firmly back into procedure. Begin configuring for approach. She reached for the flap handle. In the cabin, Owen Prescott sat back on his heels beside Captain Ferris, checking his pulse for what must have been the 15th time in the last hour, and felt something in his own chest loosen at what the numbers told him. Color returning steadily, breathing growing stronger with every pass. Oxygen saturation, measured by a portable unit pulled from the aircraft's medical kit, climbing back from where it had bottomed out into a range that no longer frightened him the way it had barely an hour earlier. He'd been a surgeon for 31 years. He had stood in operating rooms at 2 in the morning making decisions that other doctors routinely deferred, delayed, documented, instead of made outright. He had learned, across all those years, that the gap between recoverable and unrecoverable was almost always wider than most people assumed, provided you caught it in time and stayed steady while you did. He glanced over at Dana Okafor in the forward galley, being monitored by a second attendant, and saw the same steadily improving signs there too. Both of them were going to be all right. He allowed himself exactly 3 seconds to feel the full weight of that relief before turning his attention back to the man 3 rows behind him, restrained, silent, still refusing to give anyone anything at all. Owen didn't need Vale to speak. He'd already read everything he needed on Othman's face in the 11 seconds it had taken to bring him down. Control that had run out of anywhere left to go that was its own kind of confession. If you knew how to read a body the way 31 years teaches you to read one, at 7,000 feet, the terrain around Lakemont began resolving into something specific. Instead of an abstract shape on a radar screen, flat fields stitched with fence lines, a scattering of grain silos catching the midday light, a 2-lane highway running parallel to the runway, like a drawn line waiting patiently for something to finally cross it. 6,000, Gideon said. Flaps 15. Flaps 15. Briar's voice, calling it back exactly the way procedure demanded, the way she'd practiced 10,000 times in a simulator that had never once, until today, felt anything like this. Speed check, you're right on target. Gear. She reached for the lever. The familiar sound followed immediately, the clunk and whir of 3 gear assemblies, deploying in sequence. The small aerodynamic shift in the aircraft's attitude, the indicator lights switching cleanly from blank to green. 3 greens, she said. Gear down and locked. Good, flaps 30. She moved the handle, felt the nose want to rise slightly. With the added lift, felt her own hands make the trim correction before her conscious mind had even finished deciding to. Muscle memory, carrying the weight her thoughts couldn't afford to carry right now. Runway's in sight, she said, and something in her voice, for that one single sentence, sounded less like a professional calling out a checklist item, and considerably more like a woman finally, allowing herself to believe the ground below her was real. Copy. You're right on the numbers. Threshold in 90 seconds. She fixed her eyes on the aiming point markers ahead, the 2 parallel bars sitting 1,000 feet in from the threshold, the exact spot her training told her the main gear needed to touch down first, not behind it, not ahead of it. Precisely there. 500 feet, Gideon said. His voice had gone quiet now in the particular way that had stopped being about volume entirely. Kincaid. Here. Whatever happens in the next 30 seconds, you've already done the hardest part of this. This is only finishing it. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Both hands steady on the controls, eyes locked on a runway she had never once landed on before this exact moment, carrying inside her chest a grandfather's 20-year-old secret and a grandmother closing the last few miles of highway toward this precise stretch of asphalt, guided by nothing more than the same wordless certainty that had never once, in either of their lives, let the other one down. 400 feet, 300, the entire world narrowing down, second by second, into the only thing that mattered anymore: a runway, a wind, and a woman who had spent her whole life quietly becoming exactly the person this single moment would require of her, without ever once knowing, until right now, that this was what she'd been building toward all along. 200 feet, she began the flare. 100 feet. The automated voice inside the cockpit called it out, flat and utterly indifferent to everything riding on that single number. 100. As if it were only a number. As if it wasn't the entire distance left between everything Briar Kincaid had built her life toward, and the ground now rushing up to meet her. 50. She began the flare. Gentle back pressure on the yoke, the nose lifting a few careful degrees, not fighting the descent, guiding it, the way her grandfather used to say it, the memory arriving uninvited and useless and somehow exactly on time anyway. The airplane wants to fly, Briar. Your job is only to let it land. 40. 30. 20. She pulled the thrust levers back to idle. 10. The main gear touched. Not a slam, not a bounce, a clean, simultaneous contact. Both sides at once, precisely the way she'd pictured it at 2 a.m. in a simulator lab that had smelled permanently of burnt coffee and other people's exhaustion. She held the nose off. 3 seconds, 4, then let it settle. The front gear kissed the pavement smooth. She was on the ground, brakes, steady, even pressure. Not grabbing, not panicking. Speed falling 130 knots, 110, 90, 70. The end of the runway rising ahead of her, closer than she wanted it to be, and she watched it anyway, because looking away had never once been an option she'd trained herself to have. 40 knots. 30. The aircraft rolled to a stop with 60 feet of runway remaining in front of it. Engines at idle, weight fully on the wheels. 3 green gear lights still glowing steadily. Fuel exhausted almost exactly to the margin she'd calculated an hour earlier, back when that margin had still been theoretical instead of something she could feel now in the sudden, total stillness of an airplane that had finally, completely stopped moving. She sat there, hands resting in her lap, looking out at the emergency vehicles already converging from both sides of the runway: yellow crash trucks, red ambulances, a dozen flashing lights closing in on this one aircraft, as though the entire airfield had been holding its breath and had only now been given permission to exhale. Gideon, she said. His voice came back immediately. Still here, we're down. A pause. Longer than any pause he'd allowed himself across the entire flight. "Yes," he said. "You are." Behind her, the cabin erupted. She had heard applause before. Graduations, weddings, the specific sound a room makes when it's happy on purpose. This was not that. This was 138 people releasing 2 full hours of compressed fear, all at once. And it came out louder than she'd expected, and it lasted considerably longer, and somewhere inside it, there were voices calling out things she couldn't quite make out through a cockpit door that had held firm for the entire flight, and now, finally, no longer needed to hold anything back at all. Noelle opened it. Her eyes were red. 12 years in this job had refined the reflex to cry almost entirely out of her, except apparently not today. "You did it," Noelle said. "We did it," Breyer said. "You kept the cabin calm. Owen kept the pilots alive. Sylvia kept him contained. Everyone did their part in this." Noelle shook her head slightly. Not disagreeing, simply receiving it differently than it had been offered. "Come out," she said. "Let them see you. Give me 1 second." She needed it. She looked once more at the instruments, the seats, the windscreen with a runway stretched out beyond it that she had never once landed on before this single morning, and she thought, for exactly as long as she could afford to, about her grandfather. 20 years spent in cockpits just like this one, teaching her without ever once announcing that he was teaching her how to sit inside a small metal space above the earth and refuse to let it own her. She took off the headset, set it down carefully, stood. When she stepped out into the cabin, the applause changed. Not louder, different, more personal. People looking at her, specifically now a woman in a plain black shirt with pencil marks still faintly visible on her left hand. Dry-eyed, only because she hadn't yet found the room inside herself to feel any of what was waiting there to be felt. An older man in row 12 stood first, started a slow, deliberate clap that the entire cabin absorbed and gradually joined, until it belonged to everyone at once. She let them. She didn't look toward row 14. That situation was already handled. She would give the agents everything she knew, and let the rest of it belong now to people whose job it was to carry it forward from here. The door opened at 11:29. 2 federal agents came through first, went directly to the restrained man, and Desmond Vale stood the moment he saw them, without any resistance at all, the specific stillness of a man who had already run every possible version of this outcome through his mind and had finally arrived, inevitably, at the one he couldn't argue his way clear of. He passed Breyer on his way up the aisle. Stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her, a woman roughly half his age, in a plain shirt, no rank insignia, nothing at all to mark her as anything but exactly what she was, and somehow that plainness was the one thing his expression couldn't fully reconcile. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. One of the agents touched his arm. He walked forward, off the aircraft, into whatever came next for him. Sylvia came down the aisle behind him, stopped beside Breyer. "Good work," she said. "You too. I'm retired." A small pause. "This is the most useful I've felt in 4 years. You'll need to give a statement, so will you?" Sylvia studied her a moment longer, the way people study someone when they're deciding whether to say one more thing. "You know what the best skill actually is?" "In an emergency?" "Preparation," Breyer said. "No." Sylvia retrieved her bag from the overhead bin. "Preparation is only the foundation. The best skill is judgment, knowing which piece of your preparation applies right now, in this exact situation, and not a moment sooner or later. You had that." She started down the aisle. Not everyone does, even after decades of trying. Outside, past the chain-link perimeter of Lakemont Regional, a gray sedan came to a stop at an angle that suggested its driver hadn't spared a single thought for where the parking lines had actually been painted. Lorraine Kincaid got out before the engine had even finished ticking down. She'd been driving for what felt at once like both no time at all and an entire lifetime, guided by nothing but a certainty. She couldn't have explained to anyone who tried to ask her to explain it, and she stood now at the edge of a small airport she had never once visited in 74 years, watching emergency vehicles cluster tightly around an aircraft she had no official right to be anywhere near. A young airport employee tried gently to stop her at the fence. "Ma'am, this area's restricted. My granddaughter is on that plane." Something in her voice made the young man pause instead of reaching for his radio. He looked at her properly, really looked, and whatever he saw in her face, the specific composure of someone who has already survived the very worst version of this exact fear once before, and simply refuses to survive it badly, a second time made him step aside rather than insist further. "There's a viewing area," he said quietly. "This way." She followed him to a chain-link section, along the edge of the small terminal, close enough now to see the aircraft stopped on the runway, close enough to watch a set of portable stairs being wheeled toward the forward door, this being exactly the kind of small regional field that still did things the old way. She waited. She had done a great deal of waiting across 74 years, in an on-base housing kitchen 4 decades earlier, listening to a phone that hadn't rung yet, in hospital corridors, in the particular silence of not yet, that most people mistake for passivity, and that Lorraine had long since learned was in fact the single most active thing a person could do, requiring the whole of your attention, your entire self, fully present inside a moment that stubbornly refused to resolve on your schedule. The forward door opened. Passengers began coming down the stairs. Some were met by family who had somehow beaten the news to this small airport already. Some came down alone and simply stood for a moment on solid ground, feeling its solidity the way you feel gravity again, after briefly forgetting it existed at all. A heavy-set older man came down first, talking urgently to a younger paramedic, gesturing back toward the aircraft with the specific economy of a surgeon describing something clinical he needed the listener to understand precisely and completely. A woman with a gray bob and reading glasses on a chain came down next, went directly to a cluster of dark-jacketed agents, and began talking without pause, without a single glance around her, already fully back at work. Then the gate area quieted, just slightly, and Briar came down the stairs. She looked exactly the same. That was the thing Lorraine noticed first: the plain black shirt, the low braid coming loose at its edges, the duffel bag slung over one shoulder. She looked exactly the way she had at Lorraine's own kitchen table 3 weeks earlier, except for her eyes. Her eyes were doing something Lorraine recognized instantly, because she had seen it once before, decades ago, in a different set of eyes that used to come home from flights that had asked something significant of him. Not exhaustion exactly, not fear. Something closer to the specific clarity of a person who has given absolutely everything she had and is only now standing on the other side of it, still deciding how much of it she's allowed to feel yet. Lorraine didn't call out. Too much distance. Too many people still moving between them. She simply stood at the fence and watched her granddaughter move through a crowd of agents and officials and medical personnel. All of them wanting some piece of her, all of them needing her for something. Briar looked up, looked across the tarmac, found her. Something moved across her face the instant she did the thing that had been held tightly for 2 hours. The control, the precision, the refusal to feel anything at all that might interfere with doing what needed doing. Lorraine watched it release. Not dramatically, not with tears, not yet, just a loosening. The way a closed fist finally opens once it's decided the thing it was holding on to is safe now. Briar said something to the agent nearest her. A brief word, a hand on his arm, a question answered with a single nod. Then she was walking toward the fence, toward Lorraine. The young airport employee, without being asked to, quietly unlatched a section of the barrier. They met somewhere in the middle of an open stretch of tarmac that neither of them had planned, and Briar dropped her bag and put both arms around her grandmother and held on, and Lorraine held back, and for a long moment neither of them said a single word, because there wasn't anything yet that needed saying. Not right now, not with this much still sitting so close to the surface. Then Lorraine felt Briar's shoulders move. Just slightly. The specific movement of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally found the one set of arms safe enough to set it down inside. "I know, baby," Lorraine said. "I know. I kept thinking about him," Briar said, muffled against her shoulder. "Every time I didn't know what to do, I just thought about what he would do. Lorraine closed her eyes. That's how it works, she said. That's exactly how it works. You carry people with you. They don't go anywhere at all. They just stay there, waiting quietly for the moment you finally need them again. Briar pulled back, looked at her grandmother's face. How did you know to come here, she said. My ticket, said the other airport entirely. Lorraine looked at her for a long moment. I didn't know, she said. I just drove. Briar studied her. Something settling quietly into place behind her own eyes, some old family shape finally finding its match after 20 years of searching for it, without knowing that was what she'd been doing. He used to do that, she said quietly. Just know things, somehow, before anyone told him. You come by it honestly, Lorraine said. Gideon Thorne arrived at Lakemont Regional at 1:40 that afternoon. He had stayed on his frequency until Flight 1147 was fully stopped and every system aboard it confirmed secure. Then he'd briefed his supervisor, handed off his remaining sectors to a colleague, filed his incident report in the flattest possible language his hands could manage to produce, and driven the 2 hours from Cedar Ridge Center without once calling ahead to say he was coming. He found Briar in a small conference room, off the terminal's single hallway, where 2 federal agents had been taking her statement for the better part of an hour already. Lorraine sat in a folding chair just outside the door, a paper cup of coffee gone entirely cold in her hands, untouched for most of that hour. Gideon sat down beside her. Neither of them spoke at first. 61 years old and 74 years old, and between them sat 20 years of something that had never once been resolved by either of them. Gideon had known what Lorraine looked like from an old photograph that had circulated briefly during the original investigation. Decades earlier, Lorraine had known his name from a single document she was never supposed to have seen, left somewhere she would find it by someone who had never once identified themselves and never came forward again after that. You were his last contact, Lorraine said finally. Not a question. Yes. What did he say? Gideon looked at the paper cup in his own hands as though it might offer him somewhere else to rest his eyes. He told me the instruments were failing, gave me his position, his heading. A pause. And then he said these were his exact words. I've got houses down there. I'm taking it into open ground to the east. Don't let them say I didn't know what I was doing. Lorraine was very quiet. Don't let them say I didn't know what I was doing, she repeated softly. Yes, they said it anyway. Yes, Gideon said. They did, and I let them. I was 36 years old and I was afraid of exactly what correcting the record would cost me personally. I have thought about that specific failure every single day for 20 years since. Lorraine set her cold coffee down on the empty chair beside her. Looked straight ahead, down the hallway, at nothing in particular. He knew the relay was faulty, she said. He filed a complaint about it. Yes, I've known that since the original investigation was still open, and you said nothing. No. The word sat between them, without any excuse attached to it, without elaboration of any kind, and Gideon let it sit there deliberately, because he had decided, somewhere on the long drive over, that he owed her at least that much plain honesty, without any cushioning at all. Lorraine was quiet for long enough that Gideon began to genuinely wonder if she might simply stand and walk away from him, and he would have understood completely if she had. That would have been the fair outcome. The earned won, after 20 years of silence. Instead, she said, You wouldn't want me to be angry at you. Gideon looked at her. Emmett never held on to things, she said. It wasn't in his nature. He'd look squarely at a situation and ask, What does staying angry actually cost you, and what does it buy you in return? She paused. I'm not saying I'm not angry, I am. I've been angry for 20 years. And I simply didn't have a name to attach it to until this very morning. But I know exactly what he would say now. What would he say? He'd say you're here now. He'd say that matters more than the years it took you to arrive. Gideon looked down at his own hands. I was going to come forward, he said, twice over the years. I wrote the letter both times, never once sent it. I told myself it wouldn't change anything at this point. That was never the real reason. What was? I was afraid people would ask me why I'd waited so long. and I didn't have a single answer that made me sound like a good man for waiting. Lorraine turned to look at him directly for the first time since he'd sat down beside her. You don't get to decide that, she said. Whether you're a good man, that's simply not how any of this works. You just do the next right thing available to you, and you let the sum of those things speak for itself, eventually, in its own time. Gideon was quiet for a moment. What's the next right thing, he said finally. You already know exactly what it is. He did. He had known it, in truth. From the moment Briar's voice first came across his radio, and said her own last name aloud, maybe even before that, maybe he had been quietly driving toward this exact conversation for 20 years, without ever once realizing that was where the road had been leading him all along. I'll give a full statement, he said, about the maintenance floor, about what he told me in his final transmission, word for word. Whatever the review board needs from me to correct the record completely. Lorraine nodded once. His name should simply be right, she said. That's all I've ever wanted. Whatever else you do or don't do beyond that, just make his name right again. I will, Gideon said. I'll make it right. They sat together in that hallway for a while, longer after that. Two people who had known the same man lost him in two entirely different ways, meeting finally on the far side of the thing that had kept them apart for 20 full years. The airport moved gently around them, modest announcements over an equally modest intercom. The smell of institutional coffee and jet fuel drifting in faintly from somewhere near the tarmac doors. The small, unglamorous machinery of an ordinary Tuesday continuing on. Despite absolutely everything that had just happened, that morning, after a while, the conference room door opened. Briar stepped out, looked at Gideon, then at her grandmother, then at the specific distance sitting between the two of them, close enough that something had clearly already passed there, some understanding neither one of them needed to explain to her directly. She read it the exact way she read instruments, the way she read weather patterns and aircraft systems, and the 1,000 small signals sitting underneath any situation that quietly told you what was actually happening beneath its surface. She understood. She didn't say a single word about it. She sat down beside her grandmother, on the side opposite Gideon. Lorraine took her hand. The three of them sat there a while longer, in the hallway of a small regional airport, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, not needing to fill the silence between them with anything at all. It took 11 days for the story, underneath the story, to fully surface. Federal investigators, working from the flight control computer log Briar had carefully preserved, and the financial records that followed once. Desmond Vale's silence finally cracked under the pressure of a plea deal, traced the sabotage back considerably further than a single disgruntled engineer quietly settling an old, personal grudge. Vale hadn't acted alone, and he hadn't acted for free. 8 months before the flight, a smaller aerospace firm, a direct rival to the company that had developed the specific flight control safety upgrade already installed across Continental Crest's fleet, had quietly retained Vale as an outside technical consultant. Officially, his contract covered entirely unrelated systems testing. Unofficially, investigators eventually uncovered a paper trail, suggesting his real assignment had been considerably narrower and darker than that. Find a way to make the new safety system fail, publicly and unmistakably, fail badly enough, visibly enough, that airlines already considering the upgrade would think twice before adopting it, and the rival firm's older, cheaper system would keep its share of the market a while longer. Nobody at that firm had explicitly ordered a plane brought down. That was the fine distinction prosecutors would spend months carefully untangling in court. What they had ordered, in careful, deliberately deniable language, was a demonstration, a failure severe enough to generate national headlines and congressional hearings, survivable enough that nobody at the firm could later be formally charged with intending mass casualties. Vale had taken that vague, cowardly mandate and quietly built something far more dangerous than his employers had ever explicitly asked him to build, precisely because that was the kind of man He was more precise than his employers were cynical, and willing to go considerably further than the deniable language technically required of him. The story broke nationally within a week of the arrest. A congressional aviation subcommittee opened a formal inquiry into the rival firm within 2 weeks of that. The safety upgrade veil had been quietly paid to discredit, ended up, instead, mandated across the entire commercial fleet within 8 months, the exact opposite outcome of everything anyone involved in commissioning the sabotage had originally wanted. Breyer read the reporting from her own kitchen table back in Ohio, the same week she was originally supposed to have flown out for a federal hearing concerning a man who had been dead for 20 years and found herself sitting with a specific, complicated grief she hadn't fully anticipated. Because somewhere underneath the vindication of watching corporate cowardice, finally dragged into full daylight, sat the recognition that this exact pattern, buried inconvenience chosen over honest correction, was precisely the same pattern that had cost her grandfather his name in the first place. 20 years and an entire industry apart. Different decade. Different industry entirely. The same quiet, deniable cruelty underneath it all. She thought about that for a long time before she finally called her grandmother to talk. At last, about the hearing she'd been keeping secret for 11 full months. The Federal Aviation Records hearing convened 5 weeks. 5 weeks later than originally scheduled, delayed by the sheer administrative gravity of everything. Flight 1147 had already set into motion. By the time it finally sat, it was no longer the quiet, obscure proceeding it had once been designed to be. It was a hearing with cameras waiting outside, because a woman who had landed a commercial jet, with 2 unconscious pilots aboard, was by then a name most of the country already recognized, and reporters had quickly done the arithmetic connecting her last name to a 20-year-old case file that almost nobody, outside a small circle, had thought seriously about in decades. Gideon Thorne testified first. He gave the board everything he had: the documented navigation relay flaw, the review board that had never convened in time to matter, Emmett Kincaid's final radio transmission, word for word, exactly as he remembered it, the specific choice a man had made in his last 18 minutes of life, to fly blind toward open desert rather than eject toward his own safety and leave a residential subdivision directly in the aircraft's path. His voice didn't break once during any of it. Breyer watched him from the gallery and understood that this particular steadiness had cost him far more than anything on that frequency, 2 hours over Kansas, ever had, because this was a man finally setting down 20 years of silence in front of strangers who now held the power to judge him for every single year he had chosen to carry it alone. When he finished, the board chair asked him plainly why he had waited 20 years to come forward at all. "Because I was afraid," Gideon said simply. "That's the whole answer I have. I don't have a better one, and I've finally stopped looking for one that would make me sound less afraid than I genuinely was." Lorraine testified next. Read the maintenance technician's original flagged report into the official record, the one she'd found decades ago, slipped quietly under her own front door by someone who never identified themselves. The one she'd kept folded in a drawer for 20 years without ever knowing for certain whether it would matter to anyone beyond herself. Then Breyer. She hadn't planned to say very much beyond the purely technical record, but standing there, in front of a board that finally held the power to correct 2 words that had followed her entire family for 20 years, she found herself saying something she hadn't written down in advance at all. "My grandfather flew 18 minutes without working instruments, so that a neighborhood full of complete strangers could keep their houses standing," she said. "The federal record has called that pilot error for 20 years. I'd like the record finally to call it what it actually was." The board deliberated for 6 days. The revised finding, when it finally came, replaced the original language entirely. 2 words that had calcified into the exact shape of an entire family's grief for 2 decades were struck out permanently from the federal record and replaced with 4 new ones. Extraordinary airmanship under failure. Lorraine read the decision on a Tuesday morning in her own kitchen, tea going cold beside her untouched, the same tablet that had once tracked a small blue icon across a map, now simply displaying a paragraph of formal government language that meant more to her than any single document had meant to her in 20 full years. She read it 3 times through. She didn't cry, not right away. She just sat quietly in the kitchen, where she'd spent 4 decades learning to wait for various kinds of difficult news, and let herself feel, finally, what it was like when the truth caught up entirely to itself after taking the long way around to get there. Desmond Vale was sentenced to 19 years on federal charges including sabotage of a commercial aircraft, conspiracies, and multiple counts of endangering human life. The rival aerospace firm that had originally retained him faced its own separate civil and criminal process, one that would take years to fully resolve, but its entire executive leadership team was gone within 4 months, pushed out under mounting pressure from regulators, and its own visibly shaken board of directors. Sylvia Marrow came out of retirement 8 months later, this time formally, brought on as a paid consultant to help the FAA redesign security protocols around exactly the kind of access point Vale had originally exploited. Owen Prescott went home to his own quiet life, and, according to something he mentioned once to a reporter, and never repeated again afterward, finally made a phone call to a daughter he hadn't spoken with properly in 3 years. Neither of them explained the call to anyone else. It wasn't anyone else's story to know. Briar Kincaid returned to Millbrook, Ohio, the following week. She didn't miss more than a handful of training sessions with her students when a reporter finally secured 15 minutes with her. Months after the story had largely moved off the front page, she gave one of the shortest interviews of the entire coverage cycle. "I didn't do anything I hadn't already done 1,000 times in training," she said. "The only real difference that day was that it finally mattered." "Were you afraid?" the reporter asked her. She thought about that seriously before answering the way she thought seriously about everything asked of her. "I didn't have time to be afraid," she said. "I had a job in front of me. Fear is what happens to you when you're not doing your job yet. What do you want people to take away from what happened that day?" She looked at the small recorder sitting on the table between them for a moment. "That it wasn't only me," she said. "There was a surgeon who kept 2 pilots alive with nothing but his own hands. A retired agent who put a genuinely dangerous man on the floor in 11 seconds flat. A flight attendant who held 138 strangers together for 2 hours using nothing but her voice. A controller who talked me through a storm and a short runway, and underneath all of it, finally told a truth he'd been quietly carrying for 20 years. She paused. "And a grandfather who never once met a single one of those people, but who taught me everything I needed to know, long before any of us understood I would ever need it." "What are you going to do now?" the reporter asked her. Briar looked out the window of the small Ohio hangar, where the interview was taking place, past the parked training aircraft, toward a stretch of open sky that looked, on this particular ordinary Tuesday afternoon, exactly the way it always had. "Keep training people to do what I did," she said, "and keep flying." She did both. 6 months after the hearing concluded, on the anniversary of the flaw's discovery, rather than the anniversary of the crash itself, a specific choice Lorraine had personally requested, because she wanted the day remembered for the truth finally surfacing. Surfacing, rather than for the loss that had made that truth necessary in the first place. A small memorial ceremony was held at a regional airfield in New Mexico, not far from the open stretch of desert, where Emmett Kincaid had brought his aircraft down 20 years, and 6 months earlier. It wasn't a large event. Lorraine had specifically asked that it stay small, but the people who came mattered considerably more than the size of the crowd ever could have. Gideon Thorne stood beside Lorraine near the front, both of them quiet in the particular way people go quiet once a long wait has finally, mostly, been set down for good. Sylvia Marrow came too, driving 4 hours from her own home simply to be there. Owen Prescott arrived with his daughter, the two of them standing close together, in a way that suggested the phone call from months earlier had, in fact, become something ongoing between them. Briar stood at the front, with a short prepared statement she barely needed to glance down at, because she'd written it entirely in her own hand, and every sentence of it had been sitting quietly in her chest for 20 years, simply waiting for a place to finally go. She spoke about a man who had once taught a 7-year-old girl what lightning looked like from inside a cloud. About a report that had been wrong for 2 full decades and was now, finally, formally right. About the specific kind of love that never announces itself. While it's teaching you something important, it simply sits quietly in your hands, in your instincts, in the particular calm you reach for automatically, when everything around you has gone wrong, until one day you need it badly, and discover it was there the entire time, placed there by someone who never once got to see you use it. When she finished, Lorraine stepped forward and opened a small box she had been holding through the entire ceremony. Inside it sat a watch, old, the leather band worn soft with decades of use, the crystal face scratched in the specific pattern that tells the story of real flying rather than mere decoration. On the back, barely visible unless you already knew exactly where to look, 2 engraved initials, E, K, and beneath them, in smaller script, 7 words Emmett had chosen for himself long before his granddaughter had even been born. The sky does not judge, it only asks. He wore this on every single flight, Lorraine said, holding it out to her. I've kept it in a drawer for 20 years. I kept telling myself I was simply waiting for the right moment to give it to you. She looked at her granddaughter, this woman who had landed a commercial aircraft, with a stranger's life resting in her hands, and never once let her voice shake while doing it. I think, in truth, I was really waiting for you to become someone who would know exactly what it meant, the moment you finally put it on. Briar took the watch, turned it once carefully in her hands. Read the engraving, though she already knew every single word of it by heart, because he had said those exact 7 words to her once before, at a kitchen window, during a summer storm, 20 years before she ever understood she was being taught anything at all. She fastened it to her wrist. It fit. She has worn it on every flight, since every training session in the Millbrook simulator, every check ride with a new student sitting nervously in the right seat, and on the one commercial flight she took 8 months later, purely as a passenger this time, purely to visit her grandmother for an entirely ordinary weekend, with nothing at all riding on it, just a woman going home to sit at a kitchen table and drink tea with someone who loved her completely. In Brookhaven, there is still a corner house with a blue door and a garden that gets away from itself every October, and nobody minds in the slightest, because Lorraine Kincaid has always preferred things that grow wild over things that behave themselves on schedule. On the kitchen table, beside a folded newspaper, a tablet still sits within easy reach. Every time Briar flies, Lorraine opens it, watches a small icon cross the map at a careful, patient distance, the way she has done now for 4 full decades, first through a base radio, then through early tracking software, now through this, not because she expects something to go wrong anymore, not really, not the way she once did, but because it still makes her feel, in some small and unprovable way, like she is there. She watches until the icon lands, then she makes her tea, and she thinks, for a quiet moment, about a man she loved for most of her life, who once flew 18 minutes without working instruments, rather than leave a neighborhood full of strangers exposed to a danger that should have been his alone to carry, who spoke his last words into a radio that ultimately failed him, and meant every single one of them completely. Don't let them say I didn't know what I was doing. They don't say it anymore, and neither does she.